Hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in to today's InfoBurst webinar. Today's webinar is our third in the series. And as we talked about in previous webinars, it's our hope that this is an ongoing series. Right now we're running the webinar series once a month. We may get to a point where we're doing this more often. That said, if you're unable to attend any of our webinars, you'll always be able to see a recording of the webinar, usually within a day or two after we hold the session. If you attend or register for the webinar, you will get a follow-up email that includes a link to the forum, which includes that recording. And please feel free to share that among any of your colleagues that use InfoBurst. We're hoping that these webinars will provide you, more insight about InfoBurst and use cases, education, you name it. Okay, so let's get started. Today we're going to be focusing on a single topic, and that is data sources, or more specifically, how we can control report bursting and delivery using a data source. So controlling the input to a burst, lists of values, and then controlling the output of a burst, deliveries, file names, and that sort of thing. We'll get into a lot of detail with that. After we talk about our how-to with data sources, then I'd kind of like to open this up to your feedback. We have plenty of topics and issues that we'd like to cover in our webinar series, but we'd really like to tailor these around what you're looking for. So I'll be asking you for your feedback about what types of issues and topics you'd like discussed in these webinars. And then finally, we'll open up to general discussion. Any questions or comments you have will be welcome towards the end of the session. Okay, so let's get on to our how-to, all about data sources. Looking at the list, I obviously recognize a lot of your names. I think all of you are experienced users with InfoBurst, so you'll understand the basics of data source, but I'm going to recap that for those of you that may not be familiar or those that might watch after the webinar. And then I'll show you some really nice use cases. Before we get into the actual workflow demo, let's just get back to basics. What is a data source in InfoBurst? This is our catch-all term for a variety of sources that we can use to extract data for things like LOVs for a parameter for bursting, or email addresses for an email delivery. We can use data sources for things like our XML data cache. We can use data sources for a variety of applications in InfoBurst, but today we're going to be focusing on burst input and burst output. So new users will often ask us, why would we use a data source, right? Because wherever we'll use a data source in today's examples, you can hard code information like lists of values and email addresses. Well, with InfoBurst, we're always looking to optimize workflow, and that means avoiding duplication of work. So if you have these data sources already in your organization, be they database tables, Excel files, what have you, let's go get that information from where it's being stored and maintained versus duplicating all of that in InfoBurst. For our purposes today, the supported data sources are a database table, so a query against a table. This can be a query or referencing a stored procedure or a view. And with the database connection, that can be Oracle, SQL Server, or any database that we can get to using an ODBC connection on the server, so a database query, an Excel workbook, and then the built-in data source in InfoBurst, which is called the multi-column list. Today we're going to be focusing on the first two, database query and Excel. So let's get right into a few demonstration workflows. Actually, let's minimize you. Okay. All right, let's log into InfoBurst, and we're going to start out by creating a few data sources. Just in case you're not familiar with how these data sources are built, you'll get a good sense of how that works. So let's start with, let's get on our demo folder here, and we're going to use two different data sources today. We'll use a database connection and query, so let's create that. So we'll call this connection DB source. This will be SQL Server. The workflows are subtly different if using Oracle and ODBC in terms of how we code our connection strings. Information about these can be found in the help desk. Just do a search for database connection and you'll see all the different connection strings that you might use. So with SQL Server here, I've got SQL Server 2016, so that means I need the server name and the SQL Server instance name, which in my case is SQL Express. The name of the database or catalog is sample, and then I provide my database credentials. Okay, so we're connected, and now I can go about writing a query that we will use to drive both the burst input and burst output. Let's call this states list, and this will be a simple select star from states. So we'll add that, and before we can use a database query in InfoBurst, we must test it and validate that it works. And we can see here this brings back a table of data, variety of columns, and we'll talk about how all of these might be used in our workflows. But primarily we're focusing on this first column, which is state. This is our list of values where we're going to burst a web intelligence report. Okay, so that's our database data source. Now let's create our Excel data source. So to reference Excel, we need to create something called a file list. So from our new menu, we select file list. We'll give it a name. I'll just call this Excel source. And before I create this, let's go look at the actual Excel file. Very simple. I've got 3 columns, state, city, line, and 3 rows of data. Now the one drawback working with Excel is if you've got this Excel workbook open and InfoBurst tries to reference it or read it, you'll get an error. And this is, like I said, that's kind of the one drawback of Excel. If you're aware of that and are diligent about closing your workbook before you use it in InfoBurst, you won't have a problem. So let's close that. And now we're going to go and reference that Excel workbook. So I have that in a network share that I've mapped ahead of time. So if I select the ellipsis, it's in my documents folder, and it's down here. It's called state-city-lines.xlsx. So we say OK. So we'll add it, and then we recommend testing it before you try to use it in a burst. So this section below here details, this does not dictate how the Excel file list is used in a burst or any place else in InfoBurst. This is purely for test purposes. So here what we want to do is test InfoBurst's ability to access the Excel file out there on the network, and more importantly, read it. Make sure we have access rights set correctly. So I'll just put in the first column, which is state, and all we're doing here is telling InfoBurst to go out and read the state column from Excel. So we'll save that, hit our little refresh button here, and success. We got back our list of 3 state values. So this file list is now ready to use. Okay. Let's start with first using a data source in a burst. Let's start with this performance by state report. If I double click this, you'll see this report does have a parameter called enter values for state, and we'll be bursting using this parameter. So let's create our burst. We'll call this states burst and add. I'll just say now, if any of you have questions about this workflow, please feel free to open up the questions panel on your GoToWebinar panel, put in the questions. I'll be getting to those as soon as we finish up the workflow demo. Okay, so again, Webby report, 1 parameter, simple example, and by default, you're presented the default value from business objects. You can hard code the values, but again, not terribly efficient. We're going to go out and utilize our data source. So we select data source as source type, we select the ellipsis, and then when I select my database connection, I'm displayed a list of queries. There's just the one states list, and I say OK. Now at this point, we don't have a match between the parameter value in the report and the column name in our data source. So I've taken a screenshot, and I'm just going to display that up on our top left corner here throughout the webinar so that you can reference the columns in our source. So again, we have a column here called state and a parameter called enter values for state. We can address this mismatch of one of two ways, because right now InfoBurst doesn't know that this equals that. So we need to tell InfoBurst that this equals that. So at the burst level, we can simply say column to use is state and apply. But we would recommend using a parameter alias. It's a more efficient way of managing these associations. So let me delete that. We're going to close the burst, and we're going to go out and create a parameter alias to link those two values. Let's close the burst. We don't need to save that. So we're going to open up the settings panel. This is administrator only. And down here under system configuration, we have this parameter aliases tab. So we're going to create an alias called state, which matches the column name in the data source. And we're going to associate that with the parameter name. So once I code in the alias name, I just come down to this box, and I can either hit the drop list or just start typing, and it will auto-populate parameter values. So enter values for state, that's the one I want. It's the first one. So I just select my plus to add it to the list of parameter names, and there can be multiple. I could have other parameters from other reports that maybe have slightly different text in the prompt name that we'd like to associate with this alias. We can do that, but for now we're just going to use the one. So I've got my alias set up, I select add, and now it's in our list of aliases. So now let's go back to the burst. And again, for the parameter, I'll select my data source, select the connection in the query, and OK. Now I don't have to tell InfoBurst what column to use. It knows that state equals enter values for state. So we're good to go here. Okay, so that's using a data source for a single parameter. Now let's look at an example of using a data source for a report that contains multiple parameters. And if you're not aware of this feature, and a lot of customers I talk to aren't, let's build the burst first, and then I'll give you the backstory. So we're going to take this lines report here. Let's add that to a burst. Call this lines burst. You can see this report has 3 parameters, right? Now we could, in this case, I'm going to use my Excel data source, and that would mean, selecting data source, ellipsis, Excel source, OK, apply, and repeat 3 times, which is OK, right? If you've got a few parameters, that's probably not too much work. But like many features in InfoBurst, they were inspired by real-world challenges that our users have presented us. And we had a customer come to us many years ago and say, OK, this is great. We can use data sources. It's a more efficient way of managing these values than hard-coding them in InfoBurst. But our reports have, and in their case, I think it had 40 or 50 parameters. I'm not a reporting person, so I can't even tell you why they had so many parameters, but this was a massive, dozens of report tabs, data providers, loads of prompts. And so for them, it was still difficult to leverage a data source and to have to apply them to all the different parameters in the document. So we built document source. Document source says, if you have a data source that has a column that matches every parameter in the document, you only need to reference that data source once, and InfoBurst will work out all the associations automatically. So let's go back to let me just refresh your memory about the Excel source. So we have state, city, and lines, and those match the 3, or those are the 3 columns we like to use to drive those parameters. So we'll apply our document source, select the Excel file list, and select OK. Click Apply, and you'll notice I get an error. It says, source does not contain a match for enter values for city. Enter values for city is actually the second parameter in the list of parameters from this report. The first one is enter values for state. So what happened behind the scenes is InfoBurst tried to match each column name in the source to each parameter in the report. It got the first one because we just created an alias for our other document that matched state with enter values for state. So that one's good. But when it got to enter values for city, it doesn't know that that equals city from the data source. So now we need to create aliases for the other two columns. So InfoBurst knows what to match in terms of the columns and the parameters. This is a one-off. You only have to do this the one time, and every other time you use a document and a data source, that association persists, and InfoBurst will automatically work out those relationships. So let's close this and create our other two aliases. So settings, system configuration parameter alias, and we will say new alias, and this one we'll call city, and the prompt name is enter values for city. It's this one, and I'll add it. So there's that alias, and then we'll do that again for lines. Wait, now I need to refresh my memory. Is it line or lines? I think it's lines. Lines, okay. You have to get that right. And our parameter is at the bottom here, enter value for lines. We'll add that to the list and add. So now we have our three aliases. We don't need to come back now to mess with those. So we'll go back to our burst, and that is the wrong burst. We're going to open lines burst, and we'll go back to document source. We'll go out and select the Excel file list again, say OK. When I select apply, oop, I got something wrong. So I did not get one of the aliases correct. Let's go back and check it. See, I selected the wrong parameter. So let's delete that. Scroll down, select enter values for lines. It looks good. Add it and save. Those look good. Okay, now let's go back to our burst. Document source. Apply, and we're good. All the matches were confirmed. So I just wanted to show you an example of both methods of applying a data source to a parameter in a document. Let's close this down. We're going to continue working now with our states burst. Okay. So we talked about controlling input to a burst using a data source, and what I've showed you so far are lists of values that are used to control a parameter. We're not going to look at filtering in this webinar, but the same would apply for a filter. So if we were filtering on state versus supplying state values to a parameter, you can still use the same data source concept to supply those filter values. So now we can talk about utilizing the same data source for burst output, right? Things like delivery email addresses, custom file naming, and so forth. Okay. So again, we've got our screenshot data source up here. And in this first example, we're going to talk about using the data source for custom file naming. So let's add a delivery, and we'll just call it file naming. And let's select network share as our destination. So I'll select my ellipsis to select one of our registered shares, and we're going to select the share folder. Now what we'd like to start off with is creation of a custom folder based on a value in the data source, right? So we're going to burst by state, but then we'd like to create a folder based on region. So I will create a folder called West and then deposit the California file in it and then repeat through the data source, right? So this value, this region value, is not in any way associated with the report. It's just a value that we have in our source that we'd like to leverage to customize the delivery. So I'm going to enter a backslash to denote the subfolder, and then we're going to open our macro builder. So when we apply the data source to the parameter to supply the state values, at that point, InfoBurst is contextually aware of all the other columns in the source, and you can see them listed here. That means they're available to us to use for various applications. So here what we'd like to do, as I said, we're going to create a subfolder based on the region value from the source. So all I do is select region, double click over here, and that's added to the path. Now, if you hit resolve at this point, because we're not reading the data source, we'll read that at runtime, you won't see the actual value showed here or displayed here, but this will give you an idea of what you'll get. So we select apply, and there's our custom path based on this extra column in the data source. And for your information, this macro is called the extra column macro, and you can identify the extra column macro by the % symbol. That means extra column. Now let's go on to the file name. So we'll open up our macro builder again, and this time what we'd like to do is create a file name that's a mixture of macros and text. So remember, we created that parameter alias earlier. So under data, when we have the prompt name selected, we can use either the actual prompt name in the macro or just the simple state label. So we want to create a file name that is state report for, and what we'd like to do here is customize the file name with the first name of the recipient. So over here in the data source, I actually have these recipients' first names in the name column, and so I'll go down here and select the name extra column, double click, and so we're going to get state report for and then the user's name. We'll select apply, and we'll leave this as PDF, so let's add that and burst now. I've got 12 of you in attendance and dutifully watching the webinar. We did have a user at the beginning say they couldn't see the screen. I'm assuming that if any of the rest of you were having trouble, you would have logged that in the question screen. So if you're having any difficulty, do just pose that in the questions panel. But I think the rest of you are seeing this okay. Okay, so our burst is complete. Let's go out to our destination, which was a network share. So here's our share folder, and we got our 4 folders created for the 4 regions that match the state value. So if I open up West, I see the California report for myself, Brian. So we're leveraging the parameter macro plus the extra column macro from our data source to achieve our custom file name. And then Florida for John, New York for Paul, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now let's talk about use of extra column for dynamic email deliveries, or what we call an intelligent email delivery. So I'm going to disable my file naming delivery and create a new delivery. We'll just call this email. And we'll select email inbox. What we'd like to do here is utilize the email column to send each of the 4 resulting state reports from this WebiBurst. So to do this, we leave the 2 users from entered value, but instead of typing in email addresses, we're going to open up our macro builder again, and this time we'll use the email column. We simply add the email column extra column macro, add it to the recipients list, and that's it. At runtime, InfoBurst will take the state value and look up the corresponding email address based on the presence of this extra column macro. Let's just change our format to HTML here. We'll add that, and let's execute that again. Now, oftentimes, when we work with our users and they're looking at kind of setting things up for the first time, we will we'll recommend this data source approach, or this what we call control tables, because you can control all aspects of a burst from a single source. And what I'll see often is that users will have some sort of master data source, meaning a data source that's designed to service multiple, if not all, documents in InfoBurst, where parameter values, email addresses are constantly changing, and InfoBurst is sourcing everything from that singular source. So it's an easy way, or a more efficient way, to control these workflows in InfoBurst. So this burst was successful. Let's go over to our email program. And so what I've got here are 4 mailboxes set up in this one email client, so we can see which recipient got which content. So this is the email that resulted from that delivery. The subject is InfoBurst Enterprise, states burst. That's just a default subject. And then we can see that Brian, myself, I was designated to get the California slice of this report. So I got the California data rendered as inline HTML in this email. And then if we go down here to John, John got the Florida slice. So everyone got what they were supposed to get based on the definitions in the data source. Let's go back up here. So I read off the subject line here, which again is a default email subject that we put in. But we'd like to control that as well. Let's leverage our macros to create a more meaningful custom subject line for these email messages. Let's go back over here. And okay, so we're working with our email delivery. And to customize the subject line, we're actually going to access this under burst properties. So we'll expand burst properties. And here under actions and email options, you have this email options panel. And we have the subject field. So what we're going to do is leverage a mixture of macros and static text to achieve a custom subject line. So let's just say, we'll use our macro builder. Let's go in here. So we're going to say daily report for, and then we want to, let's utilize that region column again. For region, let's also add a date macro. So we'll go down here to the full date section, and we'll just add today's date. So daily report for region plus date. So let's apply that. Let's save it, and we'll run that again. You can use any mixture of static text and applicable macros anywhere you see that little M icon in the user interface. So you can see all of these fields are macro aware, and all are candidates to use any of the macros that we offer. Okay, there go those mails. Let's go out to the mail client again. And so I am receiving the California report, which is in region West. So I got daily report for West. I should have typed the word region, West region, and then today's date. Okay, let's say that instead of inline HTML, these users would like to receive password-protected PDF files as attachments in the email. So let me update this because I want that to look right for region West. Okay. Let's collapse this panel. We'll go back into our email delivery. Let's change the format from HTML to PDF. And for the for the PDF and Excel formats, you do have the option to password protect them, or you can employ the zip option at the delivery level to zip files and then password protect and potentially encrypt the zip file. The encryption is zip only. It does not apply to these file formats. This is just pure password protection. But we'd like to secure the files with a password. So by default, we would enter a password, and then any user that receives a PDF would have to enter that same password to open it. But what we'd like to do is password protect the PDF files using that user's custom password. So if you come back up here to the data source, you can see each recipient has a password defined in the source. So here on the password option, if we click Allow Password as Macro, that illuminates the macro builder button, and we simply come in and select the password column, add that, and apply. We'll save that. Let's run the burst again. Okay. Let's go down here to John. So here's John's email. He got the Florida report, the PDF, and if we try to open that in the, this is reading in Chrome, we're prompted for a password. So John now has to enter his personal password before he can open this file, and it's John123. So custom passwords using the same data source concept. Okay. All right, let's back out here. So as I said, anywhere in the Burst UI that you see the little M icon, so let's go back into Burst Properties and look at a few examples. So here under email options, for example, we have a from field, subject, message, right? We could do something like, we could even customize the actual email message that the user receives. We could do something like, dear, and then we could form a whole message designed around their personal information in the data source, where we reference the state value, their first name, their region. We could have manager names, whatever we want. We could have a totally custom message, all driven from the columns in the data source. Or, as I saw one user do, they literally created a column, and each row they had typed out a completely custom message for each of their customers. So that was interesting. So, as I said, any one of these fields is macro aware, and you can reference these extra column macros. One interesting use case that I've heard on occasion is the requirement to customize the from address for each email recipient, right? So if we go back up here, we can see the data source has a from column, and the idea here is, if we're sending columns to or messages to individuals in different regions, should they reply to the email, for example, that email needs to go somewhere to someone, and we want the email to go to the proper recipient in that region. So in this example, we have a manager address set up for every row, for every region, so that if we simply go like this, right? So each recipient will now have a custom from address in the message, and if they hit reply, it's going to go to the right manager's email address. We can also do things like, let's go back out here. Let's just create a new delivery. And this is one of our more interesting use cases. We have one of our users is a national energy utility. And what they do is they leverage web intelligence to create their daily work orders. And these are the work orders that the linesmen take out into the field to do their work, right? And so they have regional offices all over the country. And so what they'll do is they will burst the Webby report, the work orders, by office, and then in their data source, each office has a corresponding network printer defined. And so if they go here, they say enable macro, and then they reference the printer column, right? Each resulting office report and its work orders are going to automatically be sent to the printer in that office. So when this burst executes, you've got work orders, coming out of printers in paper format all over the country. It's a really interesting way to to leverage these extra column macros, because I think in their case they have something like 75 offices, so they'll have 75 different printer names listed in this data source. Okay. Another recent use case that we were presented with, and this is something that you'll see in our upcoming Build 235, let's go back into the delivery, is the ability to control the various FTP fields using a data source, right? So it's the same concept. In this user's case, they want each file to go to a different FTP site, right? So that you can't do that with a standard delivery in 234 or earlier, but starting in 235, you'll be able to, create a data source that's got a server column, port if applicable, username and password for the FTP site. That can all be referenced using extra column macros. So that was another interesting use case that we saw. Then the last thing I wanted to talk about was the ability to do content grouping by extra column. Right, so imagine you had a data source using these 4 regions, many more rows, right? So you'd have multiple records for region West, multiple records for region North, and so on and so forth. Normally you'd be grouping by, let's say, the parameter value, let's say California. But if you wanted to say, okay, we have multiple states in region West, we'd like to group all state reports, so let's say PDF reports from region West, we could come into our content grouping. We could say group by document variable, and we could actually reference the region column as our grouping variable. So we'll get each grouped report will not be by state, but by region. That's another interesting use case for these extra columns. Okay. Okay, so let's just skip ahead here. Let me refer you to a few key resources on the InfoSol help desk that might help you if you want to try these workflows in your environment. As I said in the beginning, this video will be available, so you can refer back to it. So in the help desk, under InfoBurst Platform and Tutorials, right? Or you can just search the help desk. On the first page of the tutorials, you'll have creating and using a data source, right? So this will give you the basics of how to, create the database connection, how to create the file list, right? And then in each article, we're going to refer you to related articles. So from here, you could jump off and see, okay, how do I use one of these data sources as a parameter source or a document source? And then all of the output discussion today regarded the use of these extra columns, the email column, the password column, and so on. On the second page of tutorials, you'll find the Using Extra Columns article, where you'll see some usage examples, and most, if not all, of these articles will have videos so that you can actually follow along and see how it works in InfoBurst. Okay. Nobody's logged any questions so far about the use of data sources. That's fine. If you've got questions, you can log those right up to the end, and I'll make sure that I get those addressed. Now, at this point, I am asking for your feedback. Future webinar topics, right? We'd really like to, although we're excited, we've got a lot of topics we'd like to discuss and a lot of new features that are coming that we're going to show you in these webinars. We'd really like this to be driven by your requirements and your interests. So if at this point you have any ideas for webinar topics, I'd be happy to talk about those or take those. You can log them as a question. I can read those off. If you raise your hand, I can actually unmute you and you can talk about that topic. If you don't have an idea for a topic now, feel free to log your ideas, your requests in the help desk. So if we go back to the help desk under Forums and InfoBurst Webinars, right? If you select this first one called InfoBurst Webinars, feel free to reply to this, right, with any ideas you have at any point in time about a webinar topic, and we'll take care of those. Okay, so runtime error recovery, errors from the source. Okay. Hey, Don, would you, let's see. I'm going to try to unmute you, Don, because I like that idea. Let's go like this. One moment. Okay. Don, you're unmuted. If you'd like to elaborate on that that question, that would be great. Hey, Don.
Well, hello, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. Something that we have encountered recently, and InfoSol has been gracious enough to supply us with a fix. We were in a bit of a bind when encountering an error, in our case from business objects, when the document was being refreshed, and the error was related to something within business object. It was not, InfoBurst did not break, it did not fall down, and I'm honestly stretching to remember what the error was. I think it had something to do with an inability to contact the repository. But, the burst would obviously fail. And we found that if we came back 3 seconds later and reran the very same burst, not making any changes, that it would run. So we posed this problem. You can of course do this by trapping for an error and building actions based on errors. But it was just one of these things that I would have to build that and apply it to every burst that I sent off. Now, what more can I tell you?
Well, I think that in terms of a future webinar topic, I think we could certainly devote a session to discussing first how to effectively detect issues when they occur, and then talk about the most efficient way to address them. I think we could do an entire webinar on some of the administrative tools that we have available to help us gain that visibility. And as you said, right, some of the more interesting things that you and other users have done, like leveraging an action for kind of what I'd call a poor man's retry. I don't want to talk about retry logic too much here, because if I do, we will run out of time. Suffice to say, what happened with Dawn is that there was a persistent error in business objects that for whatever reason couldn't be resolved on the business object side. So because it was such a persistent problem, we worked with Dawn and added some retry logic around a very specific error. And that's what we tend to do. Retry as a generic solution in our long experience isn't terribly useful, because a burst can fail at any point in 1,000 different ways based on the environment or whatever is going on. So the takeaway I'd say there is, if you're experiencing an issue like that, come to us via support and we'll work with you and figure out what the best way to tackle it is. And we may come to a solution like we did with Dawn, where, us creating some custom retry logic based on the errors you're seeing is the best approach, or we could use some other ones. But I like that idea, Don, because I think a lot of users would benefit from simply understanding all the tools that an administrator has available to them to gain that maximum visibility and how to recover from failures. So I appreciate that. Okay, thank you, Don. I appreciate that. Okay, I'm gonna put you on mute just in case we get some background noise from you. Okay, all right, thank you again, Dawn. Let's see, we got a question from Robin. Is there a character limit in the email message if you are entering the message in the Excel file list? Robin, no, not to my knowledge. I've seen data sources that contain very large messages, and for us it's just a pass-through. We'll create an email message and put that text in it. I can't think of any limitations. I mean, everything has a limit, but I've seen very long, multiple paragraph messages, and there's no problem. If you happen to encounter a limit, we've never encountered one. Just contact us, and we'll see what we can do about it. But you should be okay. unless you're writing a novel to your recipients, I don't foresee an issue. Just on a side note, while we're talking about that message, because that is an idea that a lot of users like, that idea of using the data source as the message. Maybe we'll go back and just very quickly show you this. No, let's go there. Let's go back to InfoBurst. Okay. I'm not going to show you this in the data source. I'll just show you right here in this field. So let's just pretend that this message is coming from the data source, right? So let's just say we want to say, hello user, blah, 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 right? Something like that. This is not WYSIWYG, right? So the line breaks that we're entering here don't get respected when we create the message. This would all be run together. There's reference to this in the knowledge base, but here you can use simple HTML tags either in the message field itself or in the data source. So if I wanted a line break here, just as you see it, I would use something like the HTML P tag for paragraph, probably the P tag, or I could use a BR or a break tag, some simple tag, right, to give us those line breaks so it looks like a properly formatted message. You can go further with that, right? You can actually use basic HTML to format the text, give it a font, a color, different sizes. You can actually reference images, a lot of things you can do here, but I just wanted to make sure you're aware. If you go try this and you see all the text run together, it's because you do need to tell InfoBurst where to put the breaks in the wherever you code the message. Okay. All right, we'll just leave that up. Okay, let's see. The next question comes from Keith. Okay, in terms of a future webinar, learning more about connectivity to SharePoint and delivering to and reading from SharePoint, which is an interesting topic. And Keith, I agree with you. I think we could, well, let me take some notes here. SharePoint. So yeah, I think we could fill most, some if not most of an hour talking about, basically, how do we set up to deliver to on-premise SharePoint versus, Office 365 or cloud SharePoint, right? What are the differences? Certainly delivering files to SharePoint is a common destination for our users, but you can, in certain cases, also source files from SharePoint. For example, if you're working with an Excel file list, the Excel file could be stored on your SharePoint server versus on, let's say, a network share, and I don't think most users know that. So I think that, now that I think about it, Keith, we could explore all aspects of SharePoint usage in one of our sessions. I think what we could do there is maybe have more of a broad session regarding just specifics about deliveries, right? Some of the cool things we can do with deliveries, focusing on SharePoint because it is one of our more popular destinations. So thank you for that, Keith. Shelley proposes a topic, stitching multiple PDFs into a single PDF. Yes, Shelley. So that's referred to as content grouping, and I alluded to it earlier in this webinar. I've already got plans for a content grouping webinar coming up. That's something that a lot of users, the ones that use it, for them it's a pretty compelling feature. And then part of our goal here is just exposing to you features that you might not know about. And this is probably one of our most popular. So ahead of that, Shelley, if you'd like to explore content grouping, and please do attend that webinar. But between now and then, if you come back to the help desk under, what happened here? I'm in forums. Let's go solutions, tutorials. And if we scroll down here a little bit, we will see, right. So on the second page of the tutorials, you can start with content grouping by burst. There are different types of content grouping, and there's an article for each. So this kind of walks you through it. The most basic type of content grouping is grouping by burst. This is going to walk you through the steps to achieve that. There's also a video that might make it easier to understand. And then this article will lead you to the other grouping concepts. This was grouping by bursting variable. There are other types of advanced groupings you can do. So if you want to get started with it ahead of that webinar, I encourage you to look at this tutorial, this set of tutorial articles. It should get you up and working. And as always, if any of you have questions about workflows, feel free to contact us via the help desk. We'd be more than happy to help you outside of these webinar sessions. So yeah, definitely we'll be talking about content grouping in an upcoming webinar. So, okay, well, thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for today, is some feedback about upcoming topics. I'd like to just preview the our next webinar. So coming up, if you attended our last webinar, you saw the InfoBurst roadmap, and we're on schedule to release Build 235 at the end of May. And so our next webinar, which will probably be the first or second week of June, we will be featuring Build 235. So we'll go through all the new features of Build 235, show you workflow examples, right, get you comfortable with what you can do with these new features. So look forward to that in terms of the next webinar. So I've taken your questions about upcoming webinar topics. Before we end today, do any of you have any other discussion points you'd like to raise? It can be related to today's topic of data source. It can be something completely unrelated. I'll give you just a second if you've got some additional discussion points. And while you're considering those, I just remind you that our annual IBIS conference is coming up at the end of June. I think it starts the Sunday of Father's Day weekend. I know, looking at the list, many of you will be in attendance this year, so we're definitely looking forward to hearing from you. We're going to have 3 full days of an InfoBurst track, how-to sessions, loads of customer case studies. We'll have a big user influence session this year, actually multiples. So if you're interested, you're not already attending, feel free to drop me a line. I can give you more information. I think this is I don't know how many, it's over 20 years of IBIS, but in terms of InfoBurst, we're probably on our 8th or 9th year. This is always a really exciting chance to get together with users. Or you can just visit attendibis.com, and that'll give you information as well. So I don't see any further questions or discussion points, so we'll go ahead and end the webinar. I want to thank you all again for your attendance. Please, keep joining us. We'll try to make the topics compelling, make it worth your time. We know that at any given site we've got multiple users, so let them know about these webinars and encourage them to attend. But we're trying to really grow this as a tool of the community. So with that, thank you again for attending today, and look forward to a follow-up email from this webinar that'll give you the full video from today's session if you happen to miss the beginning. So with that, I'll thank you a third time and say have a good day. Bye-bye.